Thanks. It's great to be here, to be back here. I did look up last night my previous talk because I was trying to figure out exactly when it was. And it was when I thought it was. It was around 8 years ago. And when I talked here last time, I sort of did the same kind of thing that I'm hoping to get away with today. And that is, I came in with a set of ideas that I'd been playing with and not quite fully conceptualized yet, but sort of working on it for feedback. And the feedback was wonderful, and the conversations were great, and that work is now getting published. We have, the work was on social perceptions, sex and age, and sex and ecology stereotyping. And the race ecology stereotyping work showed up in PNAS around a year ago. And the help that I got here was wonderful towards helping that happen and develop my thinking on it. So hopefully today, again, I'm going to be talking about some ideas that are relatively new. I am not a discrimination and health researcher, but I've been paying a little attention to it over the years, and I've got some ideas that I think are a little bit novel in terms of how we might think about it. And so I'm going to lay out a framework and with a lot of speculation and see what you guys think. So before I start, I want to acknowledge a couple of folks. Andriana Kenrick, who, by the way, is no relation to Doug Kenrick, at least that we know of. And you go back enough generations, maybe. She was actually a former undergraduate honors student of mine who went off. She got her PhD in social psychology at Princeton. She now works for Facebook. And she and I together generated a lot of these ideas. And there's a chapter that we wrote for a handbook on discrimination and health that just came out, and I can actually forward that to you if you want more details on what I'm talking about today. And Michael Barlev, I don't know if some of you might have met him. Yeah, I know you know Michael. He's my brand new postdoc. He came in December, and he's now working to help me further develop some of these ideas and think about how we might go about testing them. Just as a quick overview, I'm going to talk very briefly about just some of the work out there that shows a relationship between the experience of discrimination and unhealth and different kinds of disease, and again, very briefly talk about what the existing conventional frameworks are that are being used to explain this. I'm then going to present what I'm thinking about as a life history approach to be thinking about this. And the concept, maybe one of the core concepts here, is the idea of discriminating ecologies. And I'll talk a little bit about what that is. I think, and I'll try to convince you today that this approach generates a good number of lots of hypotheses, nuanced hypotheses that apply to a much wider range of health-related behaviors and outcomes than what you get from the conventional frameworks, and may have some useful or maybe not implications for interventions and for thinking actually about the ethics of doing intervention. And then hopefully our discussion you'll help me think about where to go from here. All right, so it's really clear, there's a whole handbook on this, like I said, that just came out, that the experience of discrimination, the experience of stigmatization predicts health. So we can talk about predicting health in terms of very short-term acute things like colds and flu, more serious chronic conditions, hypertension, coronary heart disease, diabetes, some cancers, and even mortality rates, lifespan, and the like. So there's a good amount of data out there that shows these relationships between discrimination and health. There are sort of two traditional dominant explanations for this. The first is what you might think of as a stress-mediated pathway. The idea here is that discrimination causes stress, and stress causes health-related outcomes, primarily those linked to stress processes, cortisol-linked kind of processes. Prolonged cortisol release has implications for immune system functioning, cardiovascular health, and some cancers. I'm not a fan. I'm not denying that these kind of processes happen. I'm not a big fan of this approach. Almost all of the work actually is about perceived discrimination, right? So, I mean, you can think about how difficult it actually is to do this kind of work, right? Individuals don't necessarily know whether they're actually being discriminated against or not. If someone treats me like crap, is it because they don't like folks from ASU? Is it they don't like Jews? Or they don't like middle-aged white guys? I mean, what really is going on? Or maybe they just don't like me, right? It's very hard for me to know in any particular situation, you know, why it is that someone might be treating me more badly than I think I ought to be treated. And so what the field has typically done is that they focused on perceptions of discrimination and stigma. And you can think right off the bat why this would be a little bit problematic for thinking about the link between actual discrimination and health, because some people may have individual inclinations towards seeing themselves as being put upon, right? Within any group, right? I mean, within any group. And of course, if you have that kind of psychological orientation, life might be generally stressful for you, and you may have these very real whoops, that didn't want to go there yet. These very real implications of stress for health outcomes. And so over the years, I've been hearing talks about, and I'm wondering about whether there's an alternative way to think about getting from discrimination to health. There's a second prominent framework that's used to make a link between discrimination and health, and that starts looking at ecology, and in particular looking at hazards, right? So are there effects of discrimination, segregation perhaps, that expose people to certain kind of hazards that are going to have health implications? So for example, if certain communities are sort of segregated towards places where they're more likely to be toxins, closer to industrial neighborhoods, for example, greater pollutants, food deserts, we'll come back to the idea of food deserts a little bit later, then perhaps those features of ecology are going to have implications for certain kinds of health outcomes, particularly those linked to respiratory kind of diseases like asthma, and there's been links to certain cancers, food deserts, links to diabetes and other kind of eating related outcomes. So these are the two frameworks that have predominated in the field. I'm going to suggest another one. And this framework is based on life history theory. I certainly don't need to teach you guys about life history theory. My guess is 98% of you know life history theory better than I do. You know, it's a theory from evolutionary biology that focuses on how organisms, but including people, make decisions about different kind of ways of allocating limited resources. Whether that allocation has to do with sort of maintaining a body, building a body, and other forms of embodied capital. With humans, we might talk about education and social networks and status and the like. Trade-offs with finding mates and doing mating, keeping mates, and parenting and the like. So it's a theory about the trade-offs, and there's some factors that are very important for determining how these trade-offs get made and when they get made. So we can think about life stage. Right, you know, if you're prepubescent, you're not making very many decisions yet about parenting. You can think about sex. Males and females have somewhat different constraints and opportunities that may alter how they trade off these different tasks. And we might think about ecology, where I'm going to focus mostly today, and. The idea behind life history theory is that we have these evolved, functionally flexible strategies for managing opportunities and threats, and they're shaped by these kinds of variables. I'll talk more about this a little bit later, but you've all heard of sort of characteristically fast versus slow strategies, a set of strategies that are seen as often lumping together. They don't need to always lump together. And these strategies are physiological, so things related to things that people don't have conscious control over, like pubertal timing, and things that people may or may not have conscious control over, like or at least some level do, but maybe not knowing why, things like sexual activity and risk-taking and the like. And what I'm arguing is that by thinking about life history theory, by thinking about the ecologies that people are in and the kind of strategies that people respond to, as a function of being these strategies may have important health implications. So where we're going to focus here today is on this lower. I'm going to very quickly just sort of show you what's in those boxes, and then we'll come back to these later. And it's more of a framework than a theory, right? All these things don't cause all these things, which cause all those things, but they're sort of classes of variables here with certain relationships. And so the argument in the broad sense is that discrimination and stigma might in fact alter the ecologies that people are in. This makes it similar to some theories out there. Doug Massey, I don't know if any of you guys, he's a demographer at Princeton now, really smart guy. I've chatted with him about some of these. Turns out that he's the husband of my graduate mentor, who's a social psychologist, Susan Fisk. And so I've had some good opportunities to chat. So he has a socio-ecological framework. It shares some things with that framework, but goes well beyond it and articulates it in terms of life history theory, which he gives it much more nuance. I will note as well that some of you may know the name Geronimus. She has a weathering hypothesis about that talks about some features of the ecology that sort of operate via this kind of mechanism that lead to health outcomes as well. So this view does connect in some ways to those views, but in a lot of ways it's very different, and I would argue way more nuanced. You can see that I'm presenting this as a complementary approach as opposed to something that explains all those other findings, right? And that they connect in certain kind of ways. But just as a broad frame, the idea here is that discrimination and stigma can alter features of the ecology. It can alter the extent to which people are in environments that have more versus less resources. The predictability of resources, the predictability of other kinds of things, extrinsic causes of mortality, violence, accidents, pathogens, and the like. That discrimination can shape those features of environments. That discrimination can shape sex ratios, which has large influences on people's behavior, and it can play around with network connections in terms of the number of connections that individuals have, the reliability of those connections that people have, and the like. The argument, and this is really where the life history thing comes in, well, we know that these features of ecology have implications for certain kind of life history strategies, right? Strategies having to do with early sexual maturity and mating, that have to do with opportunistic risk-taking, sexual patterns, and for example, numbers of partners, the amount of investment in your own embodied capital, the amount of investment in offspring embodied capital, strategies related to fat storage, and willingness to explore environment and things of that sort. And then the argument is that these strategies, in fact, have significant, important health outcomes, right? Health outcomes that go beyond sort of those that are just linked to sort of cortisol mechanisms and the like, and that are just linked to sort of this exposure to certain kind of hazards, toxins, and the like, but have implications for things like physical injuries and the long-term consequences of those, have implications for things like STDs and the long-term implications of those, like cervical cancer, ectopic pregnancy, and things of that sort, have implications for birth weight and the implications of that, preterm births and birth weight, that have implications for things like diabetes and stroke and colon cancer, implications for drug use and drug abuse, and for certain kind of hormone-related cancers, right? Cancers that might be mediated somewhat by testosterone, that might get recruited by certain kind of life history strategies and like. So the idea here, in the big sense, is that discrimination may lead to health outcomes that go via very different kind of pathway. These are, in another way, it's a little bit different in that this views actors, targets of discrimination, as actually being proactive, involved in what they're doing. Life isn't happening to them merely, but what folks are doing is they're acting in particular kind of ways that sort of make sense, that they're rational given the ecologies that have been created for them, and that these different kind of strategies, the trade-offs here, are going to have downstream implications for health. Okay. You notice a couple other paths that I've put up here. This is just making a connection that stress need not come only through perceived discrimination in health, but features of ecology, and in fact the strategies that we and the people around are engaging in may in fact be stressful in and of themselves. If you live in a neighborhood where everyone is opportunistically risk-taking, well, that may be stressful for you in that environment as well. And then this other point, and I'll come back to this a little bit later, that you might think about these things cycling a little bit. That is, an ecology that leads to certain kind of strategies may in fact reinforce that kind of ecology. If people are acting risky, if they're more likely to be competing with each other in ways that are physically violent, that increases unpredictability, and now you can get this cycle. One implication of this is that you can end up with the implications of discrimination and stigma here long after actual discrimination is over, right? That there could be a kind of cultural inertia that sort of builds up via this combination of evoked and transmitted cultural processes. Okay. All right, and again, this probably isn't necessary for this group, but just to be really clear that I'm taking an evolutionary approach to be thinking about these health implicating behaviors doesn't imply that these behaviors are biologically determined and inflexible. In fact, if anything, someone might accuse me of being an ecological determinist as opposed to a biological one, because what I'm really arguing here is that the ecologies that are created by discrimination have a very large influence on what these what people's behaviors are going to be and what their health outcomes might be as a consequence. I'll use the word strategic a lot. I've been using it. It doesn't imply that all these behaviors are consciously recruited for this purpose by the actors. And I want to warn against sort of this slow strategy moralizing, right? I mean, humans are slow strategists, right? We tend to look at fast behaviors and we think, oh, those aren't good behaviors. And that's not what I'm doing here. And I mean, we don't moralize, you know, rodents aren't less moral creatures than elephants because they happen to be faster in their life. We don't think that way. Well, we probably shouldn't be thinking that way about humans too, who differ in the strategies that they use. Okay. All right. What's the evidentiary status for what I'm going to be talking about today? Well, there's a little bit of evidence for some of it, not tons. It's nearly all correlational. And so I'll say that right off the bat. And there are many more hypotheses that you're going to see here than findings. Okay. Let's start at the first step. So going from discrimination to ecology, and I'm just going to go through some things quickly here. How does discrimination alter? So discrimination, I'm going to argue, alters access to resources, right? Sometimes groups of people are placed into what we would call low resource ecologies. We can think about histories of forced relocation that happen in this country and that happen in countries all around the world. You can think about housing covenants that allow certain people to live in certain kind of neighborhoods and not another. So sometimes discrimination works via public policy of one formal or informal that might influence people's access to resources. You can think about other kind of mechanisms that actually just take resources out of environments. Plunder, there's a long history of that throughout modern and ancient civilizations. You can think about mechanisms that inhibit resources from moving into ecologies, things that have to do with rules for when you're going to lend for people for starting up businesses or building homes. You can think about just general commercial inattention. You can think about poor schools in certain kind of places, which means that you don't have a workforce there. That in order to move businesses that might be useful for enhancing the predictability and the resources in an environment. You can think about poor transportation that doesn't enable people living in these environments to get better jobs outside and come back and live and spread their new money in these neighborhoods as well. And of course, you can think about individual level employment discrimination. People are discriminated because they're an X or a Y or a Z, and therefore they're not getting the better jobs, and then they're not bringing that money back into their community. You can think about how discrimination may in fact shape the unpredictability of a neighborhood, of a community. You can think about the instability of employment markets that might especially exist in certain kind of communities. You can think about things that look like more proximal discrimination, and again, these lead to unpredictability. Hate crimes in your neighborhood or against your group. People who are rejected upon revealing formerly concealed identity that would have been a stigmatized kind of identity. So people living with a concealed identity in a community because of the wrong sexual orientation, or they have the wrong religious beliefs, or they have a mental illness, or whatever, knowing that upon revelation, they may in fact lose opportunities within that environment, may walk around seeing their environment as pretty unpredictable. You can think about indirect, more distally discriminating events, ethnicity correlated immigration raids, which now, or policing, right, which now pull adults out of the home, which creates a lot of unpredictability and instability. And if you live in an environment where that isn't uncommon, you could think about people thinking that they live in pretty unpredictable places. And you can think about segregation into areas that are vulnerable to unpredictable but inevitable natural disasters. We were talking yesterday about the Ninth Ward in New Orleans and Hurricane Katrina. There are places all over the world, including here, that are more vulnerable to unpredictable natural events. In fact, you live in one of those places, right? Of course, some of the buildings, actually some of these are old buildings. This is a very old building. But you can think about places that because of different kind of public policies and informal and formal, might make people more susceptible to natural disasters. You can think about adult or operational sex ratio. I don't want to go into that in any detail, but you can think about ecologies where there are now too many men of adult mating age compared to women, right? So if you look at India and China, for example, and you look at sex-selective abortion, recent estimate, so if you look at some of the different states there's some states in India, for example, where for every 1,000 boys born, there are 850 girls born. And in fact, we might think that these are the poor people who are doing it. No, these are the wealthy people, the highly educated people who are more likely to be doing that, and creating this sex imbalance. The estimate from India and China just for that 5-year period of time is something like 100 million missing women, as opposed to what you'd expect with the normal birth rates, right? You might call that discrimination. You can think about circumstances where, in fact, there are too many women as opposed to too many men, right? You can think about warfare. You can think about circumstances where some people are more likely to be drafted into the military because they don't get university, college attendance exemptions, right? Which are going to benefit some groups as opposed to other groups. You can think about differential policing in neighborhoods of young men that may pull men out of communities. You can think about communities that have other kind of problems which lead to enhanced male conflict, which then pulls more men via violence and prison out of communities as well. We can think about the effects of discrimination on social networks. There's some interesting things here, right? So segregation, especially if it's into resource-poor, unpredictable ecologies, you might think it's a bad thing. On the other hand, segregation often enhances intragroup social bonds, which may have some benefits associated with it. You can think about when people disperse into the more general population from these more homogeneous environments, perhaps in looking for opportunities for environments that have more resources available to them, where they're moving into environments where now they're going to have smaller numbers, sparse, weaker, and more unreliable social bonds, right? In order to, in some ways, to escape discrimination, or if the ecologies created by discrimination may be facing different forms of discrimination. You might think about individuals that we don't typically think of as being segregated or dispersed in the kind of way, because it's easier for us to think about that with folks who have more tribal stigmas based on nationality, ethnicity, race, and the like. But people who are non-heterosexual and have different kind of mental illnesses or deviant political attitudes, whatever, they tend to be generally dispersed within the general population, where they're likely, if these stigmatizing characteristics are revealed, are going to have some social network problems. Okay, so what I've been talking about here is just some ideas about moving from here to here. So I'm going to shift now to here. And we can think about moving from these different features of the ecology to different kind of strategies that people are going to engage in. I am going to take probably an ill-advised shortcut. I'm going to caricature here. I'm going to sort of combine harshness and unpredictability a little bit. and sort of characterize the combination of those two things as desperate environments compared to more hopeful ecologies where resources are more sufficient and life is more predictable, just for ease of communicating here. But you might think about a certain kind of what we might think of as hopeful ecologies, where resources are available, where life is more predictable in terms of both resources and low levels of extrinsic causes of mortality and disease and the like. Well, in hopeful ecologies, one of the things that we know is that folks who live in them, not folks, critters that live in them, including humans, right, tend to be more future focused. They tend to be slower, right? This is what's meant when people talk about slow life history strategies. There's an extended investment in embodied capital. There tends to be, as a consequence of that, delayed mating, partially as a consequence of that and partially because of investment reasons, fewer kids and greater offspring and greater investment in each, more likely to be mate retention. It's useful for creating the kind of both human capital, but then investing in the kids as well. In contrast to the effects of more desperate ecologies, resources tend to be more scarce. Life is more unpredictable, both in terms of resources and in terms of extrinsic causes, mortality, where the psychology is more present-focused as opposed to future-focused. And these fast strategies, there's less investment in one's own embodied capital, tends to be earlier mating, more impulsive opportunism. If resources become available, grab them now because they may not be available tomorrow. More kids, and we can think about bet hedging and things of that sort. Less investment in each. There's trade-off quantity over quality. A greater diversity in mates, and we can talk about why that might be valuable as well. And in addition to fast strategies, I think desperate ecologies also pull for different kind of eating behaviors, which will be relevant to health. For example, and well, I'll talk about this a little bit later, but eating even when one's not necessarily hungry, right? So if you, because you don't know when food may become available, yes, there's unpredictability and there's scarcity. Preference especially for sweet fatty foods. There is some evidence for this, that in these kind of the criteria for these kind of preferences for these foods are a little bit different. And of course, these are calorie dense foods, and in fact, enhanced ability to take these calories and store them as fat. We can think about how what the impact of a sex ratio might be on the strategies, the behaviors that people engage in. So we can think about a default, ratio, 1-to-1 ratio. Right, same number of reproducing males, reproductively able and engaged males and females. In these kind of ecologies, female preferences tend to drive the heterosexual mating market. I don't need to talk to you about minimal obligatory investment and the greater investment that females have in in relative offspring, the greater risk that for women with regards to mating, the increased choosiness for partners who are likely to be committed both to them and to the offspring. And within that kind of context, enhance intrasexual male competition for resources and display of such resources. This is sort of the default state. What's interesting is what happens when these sex ratios get skewed, right? So you can think about a male bias ratio, more men than women, so significantly more adult men than women in the mating market. In these circumstances, women are relatively scarce, and so their preferences are going to be especially driving the behaviors within this mating market. And in these kind of male-skewed environments, there are higher marriage rates, fewer out-of-wedlock births, more paternal investment, and the like. We might also expect to see in these environments increasingly intense intrasexual male competition and display of resources, right? There are fewer women. You've got to be better. The threshold that you have to meet to be chosen in this mating market you have to exceed a higher threshold. and this may engage riskier kinds of behaviors in order to achieve that. You might expect in this kind of environment more male mate guarding. There are a whole bunch of guys out there who aren't mating, and they're looking for other kinds of opportunities. The women have more opportunities. You might expect to see more jealousy and mate guarding within those existing relationships, and you might see more alternative male mating strategies for those who are left out. There are a lot of guys. I mean, imagine what China and India must look like, right? You know, as these kids grow up to be young men seeking mating opportunities, and the skew is just incredible. What are these guys going to do? What are the implications of that? And I'll come to some of that in a bit. We can think about another kind of bias, female bias, right? Lots of women, relatively small number of guys, right? Relatively. Now males their preferences get to drive the heterosexual mating market, where you'd expect, and in fact you find, lower marriage rates, more out of wedlock births, less paternal investment, right? The guys get to have a bigger say in sort of what happens in these markets. This means that females are now competing more with one another in order to find male mates. And you might think that there'd be implications of this that in these environments, women are likely to be having sex with more partners in order to find a partner who might invest in them. More sex with men who've had more partners, right? So more women the guys are able to have more partners, right? And we'll think about what the implications of that for health may be down the road. In these environments where there are relatively few men compared to women, women in relationships may be less likely to leave their problematic relationships because there may not be very many good alternatives out there, and we might imagine some implications of this. And we might think that these sets of female behaviors especially might be exaggerated in more desperate ecologies where women are living somewhat closer to the margins, and thus having a provisioning partner might be especially important. We might think about the effects of ecology on social networks. Might think about distinction between segregation versus dispersal of individuals. So if a group is sort of segregated into an environment that's more desperate, that is harsh and unpredictable, a lot of costs of that, but also potential benefits of cooperative provisioning. The people in this environment may be providing insurance for each other as well as other forms of tangible support. And within these contexts, there's likely to be reduced contact with powerful discriminating outgroups, right? And so, we see not only forced external segregation, but we also see internal, sort of self-motivated segregation. You often see it in immigrant communities, for example. Dispersal has potential benefits. You might leave a desperate ecology in the hope of going into an environment that has more to harvest from, right? And so there may be benefits from that, but of course now you may be losing bonds that you had with folks in more segregated environments. There's increased contact with discriminating outgroup members. So Pascal Boyer and his colleagues have made arguments about in these kind of contexts. Minority group members dispersed into majority cultures will have increased vigilance and stress and preemptive withdrawal from certain aspects of the community. You might think about because you have weak social bonds in these new communities, which means you have little insurance. And if you have little insurance, maybe that changes some health-related outcomes. All right, so now, we sort of played with these. And what I want to do now is just talk a little bit, try to link these together a little bit with what little data actually exist out here. So we can think about different health implications, so injuries and outcomes from those injuries. So you might think about ecologies where resources are scarce, life's unpredictable, there's high extrinsic mortality, that folks are going to be more present-focused, more competitive, intersexually especially, more risk-taking, okay? So that we know. Well, for young men, this competition and risk-taking is somewhat more likely to be direct and physical. That's one of the ways in which men compete with each other, especially in those kind of ecologies. You might expect more violent confrontations, more physical injury, more death, and of course, death is sort of an immediate health outcome, but physical injury often has long-term implications as well. And just as a piece of data, young black men are more likely than white and Asian men to live in these kind of ecologies, and they're much more likely to die by homicide. Between the ages, I think these data are between the ages of 15 and 24. If you look at deaths of young black men, almost half of them are due to violence, right? Compared to 4% of the same young age group for whites. Okay. We can think about implications for injury as well, having to do with sex ratio. You can think about male bias sex ratio, more men, right? We talked before about how this may lead males who are partnered to be more likely to be mate guarding their female partners, more jealous potentially about all these free guys out there and looking for mates. And here's a hypothesis. Is there an increased likelihood of domestic assault within these kind of within male bias sex ratio ecologies? We might also think that now you've got more unmated young men with no prospects, right? They're just being left behind, looking for alternative mating strategies. Might there be some increased likelihood of rape? We actually have a little bit of archival international data that suggests that this might. All these data, everything I'm presenting to you is correlational, right? So all the caveats there, but that's a hypothesis, and that has health implications for women. You can think about female bias sex ratio as well, which now there aren't that many available men out there, right? Because of this particular skew, might partnered women be more likely to stay in their relationships and problematic relationships, right? Given the skew, lack of alternatives, and might that actually increase, if not the initial likelihood of domestic assault, women leaving environments in which there's domestic assault. We can talk about sexually transmitted diseases and their implications. So female bias sex ratios, especially when resources are scarce and unpredictable. Again, men's mating preferences dominate, and women are thus having more sex with more partners and with partners who've had more partners, and that increases one's exposure and likelihood of getting STDs. And there's some data, again, correlational data for that kind of pathway. In addition, young black adults who are more likely to live in these kind of ecologies are more likely than whites to contract various sexually transmitted diseases. And we know, and especially for women, these diseases have significant health costs. Pelvic inflammatory disease, cervical cancer, tubal ectopic pregnancies, and in fact, they're all more prevalent for black and Hispanic women in the United States. We can think about sexually transmitted diseases in male bias sex ratios. You now have all these extra men. They're unmated. We talked about one form of an alternative mating strategy. There is some evidence that in these ecologies, men are more likely to have sex with prostitutes. We might also expect maybe more homosexual sex, male-male sex, and both of those increase susceptibility to STDs as well. We can think about infant health and how different ecologies and the strategies that are pulled for in these ecologies might have implications for infant health. So we know that women who live in more harsh, unpredictable ecologies, they tend to have a first pregnancy on average at younger ages. They're more likely to have preterm, low birth weight infants, and there are long-term implications of preterm and low birth weight for preterm and low birth weight infants, having to do with immune functioning, long-lasting respiratory conditions. Actually, I saw that I sort of presented some stuff twice, also for things like having implications for coronary disease as well. Well, here's just another factoid. By the way, all the data I'm presenting here that have to do with race and sex and environment stuff comes from the CDC or NIH data tables. Black women in the United States are more likely to live in these kind of harsh, unpredictable ecologies. They're 2 to 4 times as likely to give birth at early ages, twice as likely to give birth preterm, 3 times more likely to bear there's a category, different categories of low birth weight infants, of very low birth weight infants. And of course, this has significant long-term implications for those infants. We talked before about certain ecologies enhancing the likelihood of women getting STDs. There are other implications of STDs besides for the women themselves. They tend to predict lower birth weight infants and greater risk of infants born blind, deaf, brain damaged, and the like. Anyone really depressed yet? All right. We can think about weight and obesity-related diseases. So we know that being significantly overweight and obese is a risk factor for a whole bunch of things: heart disease, type 2 diabetes, stroke, cancer, certain cancers, osteoarthritis. Black and Hispanic women more likely than white and Asian women to live in desperate ecologies, and they're more likely than white and Asian women to be obese, and more likely to have diabetes, to get have a stroke at a younger age, and colon cancer. There's some traditional explanations for it. So people have looked at these links a decent amount. And so people have talked about, scholars have talked about, you eat in these environments, you eat calorically dense foods as a way of coping, right? Of sort of reducing one's stress. Well, that sort of begs the question of why it is that these kind of foods would be perceived as stress reducing in the first place. I mean, how many folks eat kale as a comfort food, right? You have a bad day, you sit down on your couch, you turn on bad television with a big bucket of kale, right? Or maybe Haagen-Dazs, right? I mean, I'm guessing more likely Haagen-Dazs, even in this very slow life history strategy crowd here. People have talked about limited access to healthier food and food deserts. It turns out there have been some interventions that have tried to bring healthier foods into these kinds of neighborhoods, into these more desperate neighborhoods. People don't buy it. Then the notion is, well, maybe they don't know how to use these kind of fresh fruits and vegetables, whatever, so they train them how to use it. Still prefer the calorically dense, hyper-manufactured, what's the word? Processed, thank you. Processed food, even when this availability is there, even when it's financially subsidized, and the like. And you have to answer the question, well, why? I mean, what's going on? What's the deeper psychology that leads those kind of interventions to be less successful? Well, an alternative is that gorging on sweet fat, that in our ancestral history, we're being able to access sweet foods and fatty foods. It turns out that fatty foods didn't want to be eaten. Right, just like we sort of run away from predators, they sort of run. So this kind of stuff is sort of scarce. It's hard to get a hold of. Fruit ripens, and then it doesn't, and then it isn't. And so the argument here, made by a bunch of folks, not me, right, is that our ancestors, predecessors, who had a special sweet fat tooth, right, would have been more likely in times of harshness and scarcity and the like. To be surviving a little bit longer, reproducing, increasing their reproductive fitness. You might think about this inclination, especially given these certain kind of environments, as cues to the system, right? You can think about this inclination for sweet, fatty, calorically dense food as being an insurance strategy, right? What I'm doing is I'm accumulating calories. I'm going to store them right here. We don't have refrigeration, right? I'm going to store them right here, and when the scarce time comes, I'll be more likely to be okay. We might think as well about people who just are in social networks where life is a little bit more unpredictable because they are stigmatized for a mental illness or their sexual orientation or whatever. And in fact, we know that social rejection and stigmatization is associated often with weight gain. There's certain mental illnesses, especially those that are linked to weak social ties, that are also linked to weight gain. Again, all this stuff is correlational. And interestingly, people who are stigmatized explicitly for being heavy tend to eat more rather than less in response to the stigmatization, right? Well, if you think, what's the logic? The logic says, well, I reduce the thing that's making me stigmatized, and therefore I enhance my social network. Well, why is it that folks would be eating more? Well, if you're getting cues that say you're losing insurance, you're losing these relationships that are useful for you in times of difficulty, right? If I'm losing that, then I especially need to store my calories in a way that can't be taken away from me, and I have them for the future, right? Okay. I think these kind of explanations are a little bit more compelling. They're at least at a different level. They're not totally incompatible. But we can think about as well fat as being a cue for relevant affordances, opportunity affordances, right? So, and I've been doing more research on this with a grad student of mine, Jamie Krem. Some of you may know Jamie. It's a cue, for example, of the ability to acquire resources, right? To in fact have consumed calories and to some extent hold on to them, not to have to expend them in effort. It's also the case that certain kinds of fat, especially on young women, cues fertility and in fact maybe even well-being of infants in terms of brain development. And so in lab studies where you enhance people's perceptions of environmental insecurity, it turns out that when people look at images of women, they prefer women who are a little bit heavier than when they're not randomly assigned to this condition of environmental uncertainty. African and Hispanic American women are not as stigmatized as much for their weight as are white and Asian women. And we have some new data, and depending on where the Q&A goes, I might show you, or at least tell you about some and show you some figures, that in fact shows that weight stigma differs tons across sex and age of folks, and it really depends on where that fat is on the body. And we have some evidence about black and Hispanic males' preferences for weight on reproductively aged women as well. That suggests something that's maybe going on with ecology there too. Hormone-linked cancers. Desperate ecologies pull for competitive risky behaviors, which for men especially, probably for everybody, recruit testosterone. But we know that high testosterone levels are a risk factor for prostate cancer, and that black men in the United States have a much higher incident rates of prostate cancer. You guys are all thinking about alternative hypotheses here. They're all good alternative hypotheses. I've got correlational data here. For women, desperate ecologies, pull for early pregnancy and more time spent pregnant, right? Having more kids. It turns out that that's actually protective against breast and ovarian cancers, right? In fact, non-Hispanic white women have the highest, in the United States, have the highest incidence of both of those cancers, right? So here's another interesting implication, that there may be some consequences of discrimination on ecology and strategies, that they may not all be detrimental to health. Some may be, and then I'm not suggesting that we discriminate in order to reduce cancer for black and Hispanic women, but just to say that there's some complexities here in health outcomes that aren't necessarily captured by just thinking about stress or exposure to hazards and the like, and that maybe we can do a better job with some of those complexities. All right, drug use, addictions. We know that certain forms of drug abuse are linked to certain health outcomes. Well, if you think about desperate ecologies, male intersexual competition and opportunistic risk-taking, well, certain drugs may make it easier to engage those kind of behaviors by, say, by overcoming inhibitions, increasing sense of self-efficacy, and so we might expect certain kind of drug use given certain kind of ecological circumstances that then may have somewhat unique health implications on down the line. You can think about weak, unreliable social networks. You live in a place where the world isn't all that rewarding to you, where you don't have a lot of insurance. If you approach people, things may not go all that well. Well, maybe there's a use of drugs under those kind of circumstances that are more designed to inhibit approach to what's likely to be costly interactions. Maybe drugs like marijuana or certain sedatives. All right, so I've come back to this right here, and so I am sketching. I am speculating out a set of processes that might get us from here to here. I'm not ignoring culture, right? I talked before about the back and forth. In some ways, we can think about evoke culture which is really what this is right here, right? So if you think about these kind of behaviors as being instantiated to some extent as initially descriptive norms within a community, people are acting that way because they're exposed to similar ecological factors, and then via social transmission processes are becoming valued kinds of behaviors in certain kind of ways, which in fact may not only reinforce an ecology to the extent that some of these behaviors create unpredictability and the like, but also can be self-reinforcing even when this might not exist anymore. I'm not saying this doesn't exist anymore. What I'm saying is a model like this, a framework like this, would be able to talk about this notion of cultural inertia that could be existing generations for generations past active discrimination and stigma. There is some interesting, so white and Asian women, as they become wealthier, tend to become thinner. Those data, it doesn't seem to be the case for African American women, right? And one of the arguments here may be a cultural inertia, and if I tell you what black men think about young black women who are curvy in all the female typical places, the preferences there may in fact be reinforcing of certain kind of weight gain, weight maintenance. Implications of this for intervention. You think about any kind of model where you got all sorts of arrows between boxes. I mean, every one of those things is a point of intervention, right? If you break these paths right here, well, okay, now you've cut the chain, and the chain, you take out a link, and the chain falls. So all these are potential points of intervention. We could think on a very macro social structural policy kind of way of creating safe and secure neighbors. All these kind of things that require a lot of investment. They're politically challenging things to do, right? They require real investment. You can think about microecologies, and there's sort of a lot of work that's sort of like this, right? You think about your local boys and girls club in desperate neighborhoods, right? Or the church group that meets where kids go to after school, right? For the after school kind of programs. Or you think about grandma, mom and dad are working, but grandma is home, so the kid, 5 minutes after the bell rings, the kid's expected to be at the kitchen table doing home. I mean, we hear stories about all this stuff where people essentially have created microecologies that, in fact, encourage very different kinds of strategies and therefore implications down the road. We can think about directly altering strategic choices, and there are tons of programs that are designed to do this kind of things, trying to motivate people to invest in formal education, to alter reproductive behavior, change eating habits. There are a lot of these kind of programs. I think there are some ethical questions that one might think about. So if you try to get people to change this stuff, and if you're not changing that stuff, right? So if the ecology is still a desperate ecology, and now you're trying to get people to adopt certain kind of behaviors that are not well designed for those ecologies, are you doing people a favor? You're not doing people a favor? I don't know. Slow life historians, the kind of people who create these programs and work in universities and the like, we tend to think that living a long time is a good thing, right? And I certainly don't want to use evolutionary principles as a source of morality, but it may not be the case that that living a long time as an individual is a good thing, right? I mean, reproductive fitness might be a good thing for some folks. And I think there's some issues that we want to think about before we go ahead and do all this do-gooding kind of things for folks without sort of the surfacey do-gooding stuff for folks without actually doing the real do-gooding stuff. How do we explore this? So I've been popping out some archival data for you. That's about all we have is correlational. It'd probably be useful to look at less weird populations. Michael Barlev has been talking to some folks. We're hoping maybe to get some access into some Chimani data that might be useful for testing some of these hypotheses, particularly related to food and insurance and health outcomes. For those of you who have other sort of cool data sets and groups who might be interested in these kind of ideas, thinking about some of these health implications, I'd love to chat with you about that at some point. In my lab and other labs, including Josh's, right there. Sorry, should point that thing. It's oh no. We've gotten reasonably good at activating mind frames that get people in a very sort of acute temporary kind of way to think that their environments are more or less desperate, more or less predictable, more or less secure. We can manipulate perceptions of local sex ratios and the like. So some of these ideas we probably can test experimentally, not in terms of saying that this is really what's going on in the real world. You want to combine real world data and correlations, those associations, with experiments that provide possibility tests. Could this in fact cause that? And then you might think about interventions which really are experiments of sorts. In fact, our lab experiments are interventions on a very sort of minor scale about how you might take some of this knowledge and try to create little programs and see what they do as ways of testing theory. Real quick, what I'm arguing here is that that this framework predicts negative health outcomes that go well beyond those mediated by stress and hazard approaches, right? So we've expanded what it means to be thinking about discrimination and health. We're trying to expand that. It predicts a whole range of factors that haven't been appreciated that mediate between discrimination and health outcomes, features of the ecology, and the behavioral strategies, the trade-off that these features engage. That some of these vulnerabilities and to particular diseases actually might differ by sex and age, right? So instead of just thinking that these people are discriminated against and this is what's going to happen to them, some of these things, particularly some of these things that are related to sex ratio, you might find very, very different kinds of outcomes for males and females and for younger people or in older folks. It predicts health challenges faced by those stigmatized for a variety of reasons. Most of the work that looks at discrimination in health looks at race in this country. So it looks at black and white health disparities. Okay. Well, this perspective, yeah, race is important, but there are a whole bunch of other things you can think about, all other kind of groups, and in fact, not groups at all. People who are stigmatized for individual characteristics related to sexual orientation, related to mental illness, other kind of things that are stigmatized. And it shows how some groups that may in fact appear to be very different, right, because they engage the same mechanisms, may in fact have health outcomes that are very similar. And how groups that look on the surface to be very similar, they're both ethnic outgroups, may in fact have health outcomes that are very different because they engage different mechanisms. It allows for the possibility that some kinds of discriminating ecologies may also provide certain kind of health benefits, right? Probably not a lot, but maybe some, and that's an interesting nuance. And it may suggest specific approaches to intervention, but also complex, what I think are sort of complex ethical considerations when thinking about those interventions. So thank you very much. I appreciate your effort, your time, and your attention, and the useful feedback I'm about to get from Dan et al. So Madeline.
Hi.
Hi.
Have you looked at all into Ed Hagen's work regarding drug use? Because I think that could offer some interesting directions.
I know it a little bit, but not enough, and I should chat with him when I see him next at Acknowledgements. Yeah. I think you're right. He very well may have data that's relevant for testing things as well. Yes.
Thank you for an interesting talk. There are a lot of things obviously we could ask about. I thought maybe you could. So you shared with us all of these very interesting predictions about behavior and health outcomes given different sex ratios. Mm-hmm. And I was wondering whether you observe any of those predictions in geriatric populations, which are, at least in the U.S., quite female biased in terms of sex ratios, very predictably.
Mm-hmm. I don't know, but it's a great hypothesis. Recently, we've been talking about looking at it across college campuses, which are becoming increasingly female skewed, right? And whether that might in fact be predicting increased incidences in sort of more casual sex unrestrictedness as well because of the female skew. I think I had never thought about geriatric population. That's a great idea. Thank you. Send me an email. Maybe we'll do it together. Is it? All right. Yeah. Joe.
Thanks. Could you go back to the slide with the boxes and arrows?
I can. Yeah, okay.
So,
This is,
thank you. So, it's true that in general, the sort of resource relevant aspects of the ecology, which is low resources, and the ones that have more to do with what's going on socially, you know, like risk of violence and so forth. Those do tend to co-vary, but of course, but not perfectly. And I think that you might find some interesting case studies in environments that were high in some and low on the other. And I'm thinking of, for example, as recently as the 1960s, San Francisco's Chinatown was by far the poorest, the most economically deprived part of the city by any number of measures. And that, of course, was a result of decades of discrimination. And yet there was very, very little violent crime. And so that's a case in which there was low access to resources, there was more pathogens, high rates of tuberculosis, for example, but you know, very little of the other kind of stuff. So, you know,
so I mean, I think these immigrant communities, especially these, you know, the X towns, right, where people coming in from the outside and they're making connections, often with relatives. People know each other. They come in. There's not necessarily a lot of money, but someone comes in, they get a job working in someone's restaurant, doing this, whatever, and then their kids, right, end up and sort of to this point, shallow thinking about this is that it may be that these social networks are really sort of tight, and there's really a lot. So there's a separation here between the resources that are available in the community and the tightness and the insurance providing aspects of these groups. And you know, you might make predictions that are based on pardon me for using the word collectivism in the kind of way that psychologists use. You know, it's an overused concept in psychology, but you could think about groups of people who culturally might tend to, in fact, be more family-based, more collective-based, where a lot of what happens is really based on relationships, and when they migrate, that is sort of maintained. That in those kind of communities, you may, in fact, see that as a huge buffer against the implications. Other groups of folks that are more individualistic, may not, in fact, move into those kind of communities, may not have those same networks when they show up, and therefore may not be buffered. And so that's initial thoughts on that. Yeah.
So this follows a little bit on Joe's comment about the social networks. So, because I think African American communities often also have very strong social networks, right? And you can think about gang culture as being indicative of really strong social networks.
Right.
But so I think that the two descriptors you have there are sparse and unreliable,
Right.
and those two things don't necessarily go
Right.
hand in hand,
Right.
And so it'd be interesting, I think. I'm just wondering, I guess, if you've thought any more about how to measure social networks in a way that actually kind of starts to dig into what aspects of those networks seem to actually have the biggest impact on these outcomes.
Yeah, I mean, part of this, it's a great question. Part of this has to do with how you're defining the network in the community and the neighborhood and the like, right? And so you can think about support that exists within, say, gangs, whatever, and what that psychology is relative to the psychology that exists now when they look outside. There's another gang on the next block, and the next block, and the next block, and the overall, and where they're pulling resources from isn't geographically sort of tight as the particular sort of groups of folks are. That is that they need to pull resources from elsewhere. So I think there's some really interesting complexities with that. If you think about gangs as individuals, right, in a space where they're essentially engaged in a lot of male-male conflict, right, in these kind of ecologies that are especially likely to call for them, right. There weren't very many gangs at Upper St. Clair High School, where I grew up in the suburbs, in the wonder-bred suburbs of Pittsburgh, right. We had a lot of guys, right, and it was a big school. You could have, but they just weren't there. These kind of neighborhoods, it calls maybe for that kind of coalition forming But it's not coalition forming against folks who are on the outside as much as for competition within that sort of neighborhood community ecology for resources within that. And so I do think
Also have
so.
incarceration pulling people out in unpredictable instances.
Yeah.
So the network is more fragile.
I think the network is more fragile, and the gang that's being focused on by law enforcement at any particular time, that may be particularly unstable, which may lead to some other kinds of things that happen when groups kind of fall apart. I think it's I'm simplifying here, right? And I think it's an interesting important question. Yeah.
So I was wondering about sort of other possible arrows that could be, of course, added to this
Yep.
richly complex landscape, particularly
Yeah,
about...
almost every possible arrow is up there, so we can add some more.
Okay,
Yeah.
great. So I was thinking about what the things that you've characterized here as outcomes as really being parts of ecology, or as things where discrimination and stigma can act on them, right? So you have things like drug use or STDs,
Yeah.
which obviously can change the local ecology, they can change local
That's right.
networks,
Yeah.
they can also be things that discrimination and stigma act upon.
Yeah.
So I was wondering what you thought about those as kind of feedback loops or other places for possible intervention.
Yeah, the first thing is that drug use should actually be here. The implications of drug use for health is what should be in there, and that's just a screw up on my part. I was looking at it earlier today and said, how did that end up in there? Wrong place. Yes, so these things in fact are a context. They are part of the ecology. They do. I mean, I guess if you're in a place that has a lot of STDs, that is going to change to some extent the strategies that you may engage in, given that you've got that kind of flexibility. Yeah, so I could see adding some arrows here as well. There's a lot of stuff going on. A lot of stuff is connected. I'm trying to simplify a little bit, but point well taken.
Can I just add
Yeah,
really quickly?
please.
I think the reason that I was asking, or just one kind of intervention that's been discussed often in the media now, is about trying to decrease stigmatization of drug use and having, places where you have kind of safe zones and those sorts
That's
of
right,
things,
right.
and looking at the outcomes for
That's right.
eventual, treatment and people getting off.
Yeah, I heard a story probably on NPR the other day, or maybe it was where they were talking about one of those kind of programs, and one of the things that they mentioned, of course, who knows how to trust this, was that it wasn't clear that those programs are actually effective in terms of changing features of the neighborhood, and reducing criminal. I think what they said was weren't effective, or there's no evidence yet that they're effective for reducing the criminal behaviors of the drug, the people who are using those programs. But yeah, you certainly could think about breaking the chains in multiple kind of places that might fit that. So Dan, and then Steve, and then I think back to you.
So thanks, Steve. A couple points. I mean, I'm completely on board with the overarching program. My points are more kind of fine tuning. I think on the topic of drug use, while I agree with you that there is no monolithic category that they're just the things that we like or approve of, like alcohol and tobacco, and the things that we don't. But that said, all substances that are subject to abuse have in common the fact that the rewards are in the present and the costs are in the future. In terms of the health costs, in terms of the legal costs, and in terms of the trade-off with other opportunities and uses of finance. So I think drug use is easily assimilated to the general schema simply by saying this is a consequence of steep future discounting, right? That we should expect people on a fast life history trajectory to always privilege immediate rewards at the expense of future benefits.
What I was trying to do is I was trying to think, well, maybe different drugs, different kinds, they facilitate different kind of behaviors.
I understand,
That's right.
You made that very clear.
That's right.
I'm suggesting there's maybe a simpler explanation. Because I think that the comorbidity, I'm not an expert on this by any means, but I don't think that the comorbidity and patterns of use data support the idea of this kind of very selective, strategy relevant substance. Right? There's just, does it feel good now, and does it cost me something later? That's ultimately.
Well, I'm glad I didn't go into my costly signaling hypothesis. I almost took the drug use out for today. But I've got this other idea that's even worse, right? Which is causal signaling. That is, in some of these neighborhoods where presented status for risk-taking and the like might be especially useful, that actually engaging in activities while under certain influence of certain kind of drugs that might otherwise make you less successful may be a peacock's tail. Anyway, go ahead. That's
I'm glad you didn't present that.
yeah.
Secondly, I think there are costly signaling aspects of some of this, but they have to do with the display of appropriatable resources, right? So walking around with expensive jewelry is an honest signal of the ability to acquire and retain those resources in a dangerous environment.
That's right.
On the sex ratio stuff, I agree with most of what you said, but I would challenge the idea that that when men predominate, you would expect greater domestic violence, because at least, and this is an analogy and it's maybe an imperfect one, but the literature on asymmetries in mate values suggests that the opposite will obtain, right? That in fact, men will work very hard at retention, but women have a lot of other options, and so coercion should not be part of that repertoire. So I think that one prediction may not hold. And then lastly, on the...
Can I comment on that one?
Sure, absolutely. No, I'm interested.
I've thought about that some, and I probably should have mentioned, and I've been trying to figure out that there's probably a switching variable that just may have to do with individual differences. So I think you're absolutely right that there ought to be a pressure for guys doing the kind of things they need to retain their mates in these environments when there are alternatives. I see what I suggested as well, and I've been thinking about what a switching variable might be between both of those, and it may have to do, I don't want to use the word impulsive, but status threatened, insecure, maybe sort of insecure status thing that would lead the other direction. But I totally take your point. You're probably right in a main effect kind of way.
Maybe the middle ground is that you might expect incidents, right? But it's not going to be a consistent pattern because it's not effective. When women have options, they lead.
That's right.
And the last on diet and food consumption, I agree completely with the argument that you're laying out, both in terms of the fat storage and in terms of the dietary choices. I think perhaps the single strongest cue of resource scarcity is the experience of hunger. Right? So while all of the other stuff, the violence, the economic insecurity, the denial of opportunity, and so on, all of that should feed into it. The regular experience of hunger by itself is likely a really important part of this. And in fact, Daniel Nettle has written a couple of papers in which he argues that a lot of the things that we attribute to a larger, more integrated life history explanation are directly attributable to regular food deprivation. Drawing on the literature about the psychological changes that result from food deprivation. Whether those arguments are incompatible or not, I think that is whether one is exclusive to the other remains to be seen. I tend to see them as complementary, where the hunger is just a cue that is feeding into the life history system.
It's one cue, but even in the absence of hunger, there may be other cues that would keep, right? And there are some experimental studies where people are sort of, now what counts as sated may look different too, right? But where people have eaten beforehand and now they've got the food in front of them and you manipulate their perception of environment and keep eating, right?
Yeah,
So,
what Nettle is talking about and what I think the clinical literature on caloric restriction supports is chronic hunger, right?
That's right.
Rather
Yes.
than
Right.
you missed lunch.
That's right.
And that results in, they're related in some of the changes in the focus on food and the nature of future discounting, but the chronic hunger is what really has much more systemic effects.
Great, thanks. I think Steve was next.
Yeah, I guess my comment or question is consistent with the previous two, looking for other additional links in between your boxes. I think what's really powerful is your focus on life history strategies and decision making, and I'm intrigued about a possibility between the hazards component, which you got directly linked to health outcomes, but also how hazards, exposure to hazards can directly influence the strategic decisions that people make. So for example, I'm vaguely familiar, I'm no expert by any means, but I'm familiar with some arguments that exposure to environmental lead, for example, influences the ability to effectively self-regulate.
That's right.
And that would be a mechanism that
That's right.
isn't just led to health, but lead
Right.
lead exposure influences decision-making capabilities.
Right.
And it's very consistent with what you're
That's right.
arguing,
Right.
that environmental lead exposure leads to short-term
Right.
decision-making, impulsive behavior. And there's some very, I think, compelling evidence about the relationship between environmental lead exposure and the ability to successfully self-regulate.
Right.
It's extremely consistent with what you're talking about.
Right. Yeah, so you could think about this distinction maybe between capacity and motivation. And what I'm really talking about is what kind of strategies are motivated by circumstances. But of course, you could have capacities that come in that make some strategies possible and other strategies not possible. Totally. And in fact, some of the stuff having to do with eating, right, even in more desperate ecologies, still presumes that there are these calorically dense foods to be eaten, right? I mean, so we're not talking about places where there's just no food, right? We're talking about places where there are a lot of calories, and then but gradations in
And also the
desperations
nature
leading
of
to
those,
those.
those carbohydrates that might create some peaks in sugar and some plummets in sugar, which should affect the ability to think strategically, long versus short term.
Right.
So I think you get into some really interesting complexities using your model by actually combining some of the things that you've got bracketed separately at this point.
Good. Thank you. Thank you, Rob.
I just was wondering, so it seems like there are certain parts of this causal pathway that are very well articulated, and what seems to be missing to me is the biology. Like if you're linking these extrinsic factors to health outcomes, the health outcomes now seem to be a combination of biomechanisms and an actual pathophysiologies, which are sort of at different points in my mind on this causal pathway. And I see stress here, but I'm not sure whether I wasn't sure at least whether you were referring to stress psychology or stress physiology, which in some of these conditions might become quite divorced.
Yes.
And so I was just wondering if you could expand a little bit on how these life history strategies actually become biologically enacted in ways that relate to some of these health outcomes that you've connected them to. In a way that it's more clear, where something like pollutants would be associated with asthma.
Right. Yeah, I'd love to be able to do that. Yeah, so here I'm actually thinking more about this as the physiological stress process, but I actually wasn't spending much time with that because that's not what I was interested in. I was looking for things that might bring us. You're entirely right, and my ability to go from here to some of the some of the things aren't mediated by physiology at all. So, I'm a social actor. I take risks. My risks put me in direct conflict with other men, and they hit me and they break my face. And now I have a problem where they injure me and I bleed out, whatever. I have a problem, right? So the physiology is irrelevant for certain kind of things. For the other kind of things that are linked between, say, STDs and certain kind of cancers, I don't know that. I mean, for some of this stuff, there's a really huge black box that I know nothing about. One of the things I'm doing with my new postdoc is we're starting to learn more about fat and eating and fat and different kinds of fat and the implications of this. And so we're starting to unlock some of these boxes as we're starting to work on it. But yes, totally necessary for this to be a highly intelligible framework, as opposed to right now, which is a little bit more than heuristic. But yeah.
Speaking about arrows, I see the arrow linking the life history strategies to stress, and I'm wondering if it could go the other way also, where stress from perceived discrimination is enough to cause a change in life history strategy without being mediated by change in ecology. I guess I'm wondering because we know that things like certain types of stress, like pregnancy, anxiety, are correlated with preterm birth, and so how can that, is that arrow something that you thought about and left out for a reason?
Not left out for a reason. I was starting with the minimum number of arrows for for throwing a new perspective out there to see how far I could push it, and have been slow to be adding other arrows. The two sets of arrows that I added right off the bat were mostly just to show some kind of connection between this approach and the weathering approach, and this approach and Massey's socio-ecological kind of approach, and to be thinking about culture, right, as feeding back around and the like. Yeah, I mean, in some ways, pregnancy stress is an exogenous form of stress within this particular model that can have implications for other things. And so, yeah, my guess is that we could go from just about everything here. I mean, here's another arrow I didn't include. The arrow from these strategies to discrimination and stigma, right? So, people watch behaviors going on in neighborhoods and communities and cultures that look like these fast strategies, and it reinforces or strengthens or creates new, right? Efforts towards discriminating, controlling, and the like. And so there's a feedback loop there as well that I haven't talked about here. But all these specific suggestions for different kind of connections, that's all great. It's stuff that we need to do as well and think about as well. You can sort of see that my approach here was not to go deep into any of these, right, any of these aspects, but to sort of sketch a broad frame to see what kind of, to see how far that could get me in terms of creating something useful that I may now focus down deep. Actually, I have a question for you. So of these, this is one of these pragmatic kind of questions, right? So let's say I want to go to, NIH spends a lot of money on discrimination and health, right? And this view probably isn't going to be all that, isn't going to elicit maybe a lot of enthusiasm at the beginning because it's almost all stress-based research. You keep nodding your head, so you know this research well? Yeah.
Yeah, I work with Brenda.
Okay. Oh, you're Jeff Hunger? Oh, so out of context. It's got it. Actually, you heard a version of this like a year plus ago. Okay.
Yeah, I read the chapter.
And you read the chapter as well. Okay. I'd be interested in your sense of thinking about so, you sort of derive it going in this direction, but of course NIH is organized by health outcomes, right? In terms of the different institutes. Which of these things would strike you as both more interesting, from an NIH / public policy / understanding discriminatory health related things, and which kind of things may be more open to funding? In some ways, I don't have a huge commitment to these different outcomes, right? I'm more interested in thinking through the framework, right? Do you have a sense of what might be more interesting, or what aspects you find more interesting about this? Yeah.
I think this looks like NICHD kind of work where it's like lifespan approaches, early exposures, programming, lifelong strategies, and developmental trajectories. That would be my instinct.
So I need to find myself a developmental psychologist like Bruce Ellis to come on and inform me, or someone like that.
Yeah.
Okay. So NICHD. What about other possibilities here?
NIMH is reorganized with the RDOC framework, and this would fit into that. That it's not targeting any particular psychopathology or health outcome, underlying mechanism.
That's interesting too. I hadn't thought about that. NIMH sort of chased me away around 10, 12 years ago when they I was doing stereotyping stigma research, not on health, but for a long time, and they just said, not anymore, we're not interested in the perceiver side of things. And so haven't paid much, but you're right, with this new framework that might be useful. I saw a hand. Was that you, Femi?
Yeah. So I know the NIH has
Wait, which you said NIH?
The NIH have a new one about minority health outcomes.
Right.
Because one of the links I'm curious about is the link between sort of ecology and like history strategies, because sort of this assumption is that people sort of live within this ecology that they don't think is going to change. And so when we talk about sort of these impacts of ecology, we can sort of lump whites and blacks and other people of different colors who live in desperate ecologies. But my hypothesis would be that sort of the living in the desperate ecology isn't going to predict some sort of like history of strategy behaviors in these different groups, to the extent to which they think that this is the ecology that I live in, but this may not be the ecology that I sort of resist in the future. And so he might be able to get some leverage in looking at how sort of poor individuals of color compared to poor whites sort of face sort of uniquely more so these sort of outcomes from living in sort of these desperate ecologies.
Right. So I've thought a little bit about, I'm in the Phoenix metropolitan area, and we have a very large Hispanic population that ranges all the way from, so my kids go to school with kids of illegal immigrants, and they come here, and there's no English being spoken at home, right? And they live in sort of poor parts of the broader community, and folks who are both coming with more resources and living in different parts, but also there's pretty good social mobility among Hispanic Americans, and so the notion of seeing another ecology in your future, right, and having those comparisons, the folks that are here, the folks that are sort of transitioning, the folks that are already there, may make for some very interesting comparisons. Is that sort of what you're getting at?
Yeah.
The ability of seeing trajectories that move you out of one ecology.
Yeah.
Now, some of the things that Pascal Boyer talked about in his POPs paper, I think that's what it was based on this interesting paradox of immigrant Hispanics actually tend to be healthier than their kids and their grandkids, right? And the question is why? And his argument for that was the stress that gets created when in fact you disperse outside of your sort of your home group, right? And now you're heading out into a community. You're confronting folks who your evolved coalition detectors are saying outgroup, and now that increases your stress levels, and so you end up with greater risk of these things for second generation and third generation Hispanics compared to first generation. Yeah.
I'm sorry
Okay.
that this is
We're out
a
of time.
stimulating discussion. I'm sure we could go on all afternoon this way, but we're.
Well, thank you very much.
So appreciate it.